Why is suffering a reality of life? All of us have gone through our valley experiences. The grief, the loss of a loved one, in many cases divorce and the heartache that brings. The world is so full of suffering, and it seems that no one gets a pass. And of course, in the context of what we're doing with the Prophetic Connection series, we're looking at Jewish suffering. So while suffering is hard to understand, the other side of that coin is that there is a God who makes promises to us. He doesn't promise us that we will escape suffering, that we won't pass under the waters or through the fires, but he does offer us hope that he will bring us through these things and beyond them. And I think when we speak about human suffering, we must always do it in the context of a broader eternity, that this life is a rehearsal for the life that is to come. And that life is for eternity, not for 75 or 85 or even 100 years, but for eternity. And I like to think that we are being shaped, and certainly suffering can shape us positively, because it can make our hearts more tender to the needs and the suffering of other people. So while none of us likes to go through suffering, there is a benefit if we hand it over to God and if we pray and ask God to help us make sense of it all. I find encouragement in Psalm 23, which is a psalm that's familiar to most, if not all, Christians. And it's a helpful psalm in the context of speaking of suffering, because the psalmist writes in verse 4 of Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Now, this is a Jewish psalm written by a Jewish psalmist. And he doesn't deny that there is the valley of the shadow of death, but he says at the same time that, speaking of God, that you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. If I just try to understand what that really means, it's almost like the shepherd watching over his flock, and he has the rod, and perhaps it taps as he moves along. But the psalmist is saying that even though I must walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. We understand that beyond every valley is a mountain, because that's how valleys are formed. And it seems to be part of God's grand scheme of things that we must go through these dark valley places in order to get to the mountains that are on the other side. And what's crucial in all of this is how we react when we're in the valley. Do we blame God? Do we question God? Or do we trust God to bring us out through to the other side? The immensity of what the Jewish people have suffered down through the centuries, but especially during the Second World War with the European Holocaust, was driven home to me on my first visit to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in the city of Jerusalem. There they have the images of the Holocaust, the people that were lost. Consider there's 6 million men, women, and children, 1.5 million children. And you know, the theme for this latest series of the Prophetic Connection is Israel, a blessing to all nations. And I find myself wondering, what did we lose? Which blessings did we lose when 1.5 million European Jewish children were killed in the European Holocaust? I mean, among them there had to be geniuses, scientists, children with incredible potential, because we can see how the Jewish race has blessed the world through their innovations and the research. So imagine what the world lost when we lost 1.5 million. My wife had cancer some years ago, and she lost a kidney to cancer. She recovered from it. But I think of cancer and the devastation that causes. Was there among those 1.5 million Jewish children a boy or a girl with the ability, the brain power, the research ability to find a cure for all cancers or any of the other major diseases that plague humankind? What did we lose? And being there was driven home to me what the world lost. When I looked at the images of the men, the women, and the children, I realized what we lost when the Holocaust occurred in so-called Christian Europe.
In a conversation with the Croatian foreign minister on July 21, 1941, Hitler reportedly said, "If only one country, for whatever reason, tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family will become the germ center for fresh sedition. If one little Jewish boy survives without any Jewish education, with no synagogue and no Hebrew school, Judaism, is in his soul. Even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school or an Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it." Hitler did not need to be convinced about the Jewish influence in the world. He believed that the Jews had power within them to change the world around them. This is also why he was just as determined to extinguish the light of Jewish influence that had burned from Abraham's time onward.
Hitler looked at himself as a savior. He said, "I'm saving the world." He said, "Providence decrees that I will be the greatest liberator of humanity." He said, "I'm freeing humanity from a burden that has taken over, a false and degrading vision called conscience and morality, which very few can bear." That's an exact quote from Hitler. He says, "The world is crushed by an artificial system of morality, which is too great. I will liberate you from that. And how do I do it? I get the Jews out of the world."
This was Hitler's final solution, to end once and for all this Jewish problem that had plagued humanity for centuries, and he was determined to succeed where others before him had failed.
Before I got to the concentration camp, we were sowing fertilizer over the grain, and the fertilizer were black like ashes. And the farmer told me, he says, "You know what? That's human body." See, they burned the body and bagged them and shipped them to be used as a fertilizer.
Reverend Walter Senko grew up in the Ukraine, but moved to Germany to work for a German farmer just before the outbreak of World War II. This particular farmer was also a patriotic German who tried to convince Senko to join the German army.
And he was bugging me and tried to talk me in to join the German army, volunteer. And I told him I cannot go to the army because I had 6 brothers there in Ukraine, in Russia, and they were on the front. They were fighting against Germany. And I said, Germany's gonna send me there to fight my own brothers. I says, I cannot do it, I cannot. And he was showing me the soldier, said, look at how nice he dressed, and you're gonna be like this. And even if the war gonna be finished, you can marry German girl, you know, you're gonna be like German. I never accepted, and he just hated me. He didn't like me. When I told him I cannot, he was very mad at me, and I believe because I didn't do nothing. And one day 2 policemen came and arrested me.
Senko was placed initially in a local jail. Shortly after that, he was transported in a vehicle full of other prisoners. They were all taken to a concentration camp called Buchenwald. It was the summer of 1944. In Buchenwald, Walter Sanko ceased to have an identity and even a name. Instead, he became a number, one among millions of Jews and Gentiles who were forced into hard labor with barely enough to eat. Sanko has vivid memories of the short nights and longer days he spent there. 9 months that would leave physical and emotional scars that have lasted a lifetime.
52,259. And they didn't call me by the name. The SS first we had to really learn, because they whip you right across the head if you don't answer. So he says, 52, 259. And I say, yes, that's my number. I saw a lot of Jewish people too. And they were there, and we knew they were Jewish. We couldn't talk with them, but we saw them, we walked beside them. We knew they are Jewish because everyone had David's star on the chest and on the back. So you don't have to ask who is he. We knew they were Jewish. And every camp, concentration camp, has a lot of Jews.
Walter Sanko was bewildered by what he saw. Why were so many Jews being hunted down by the Nazis and targeted for extermination? Did Hitler view the Jews as a threat to his own aspirations of a Germany reserved only for Germans? Or was he motivated by something more sinister, more evil that lurked within his subconscious?
He didn't like the Jews. He wanted to be himself boss. And that's why he was killing the Jews. There is not really, there is nothing to explain why. Because they didn't have no country. They didn't fight for their country, and the Jewish people didn't fight. They arrested them, they killed them, they did everything. They put them in ghetto and starved them to death, children and women and men.
I was one of the children of this world who didn't have a childhood in the sense of everybody. I mean, to be a child in the Holocaust is not easy. Not in terms of what is being described in literature and some films and some videos. It is not easy. And it can't be explained. It is not easy because you are part of a process of dehumanizing Jews altogether.
Yitzhak Meir is one of the few Jewish Europeans to narrowly escape death at the hands of Hitler and his brutal regime.
How was it possible that people got up every morning and started 8 hours of Holocaust? And some of them excelled, and some of them were decorated, and they were just killing flies and as I said, vermin. And they came home later on, and they sat in their armchairs, and if there would have been TV at the time, watching TV, there wasn't. They were listening to Mozart and they were. The abnormality of Holocaust is that it was very, very normal.
The Jewish people were hiding in the sewers, pipes, you know. They tried to escape, so they search after them, they find them, pull them out like animals. They really didn't even call the Jewish people people. Jude, Jew. And it was terrible, and you know, children, everybody, the same thing. There's no difference.
My father was sent to a camp in France, from there to Auschwitz, and my mother was left alone with 2 children, pregnant. Now, it's a long story how we got there, and so forth and so on, but we succeeded, she succeeded, without speaking a word of French, and I was the one. Being arrested, we were committed to a convent, and then she fled there with the help of a doctor who was also a clergyman. And we crossed on foot in the winter of '43 the border to Switzerland.
As a child, Meyer, his younger brother, and pregnant mother managed to escape to what was then known as British Palestine. Others were less fortunate. In Buchenwald alone, over 50,000 people died from hunger, disease, and sickness.
Today, more than ever before, it seems as though our world is at a tipping point as generation after generation slips further into chaos and darkness. Not since the days of Noah has the earth seen such decadence, immorality, and violence. But what does this mean for those who believe, and what consequences await for those who do not? As it was in the days of Noah, the DVD series of Dr. John Tweedie's 21st season of The Prophetic Connection explores the scriptures to uncover the meaning behind the signs of these troubled times. Call the number on your screen now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit C4IAmerica.com to become a new monthly partner with your gift of just $25 a month or more, and you will receive this DVD set, ideal for individuals or small group studies, along with the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection. We're waiting to hear from you.
Concentration camp, or 3 days before the American came, the German didn't have time to pick up those dead people and ship their, what they did, crematorium or put in a pit, you know. And so German came and says, anybody die in a barrack, just throw him out the window. And see, by every barrack there was 50, 70 body, dead body, lay like this, eyes way dipped in her forehead, mouth open, knee like an apple, like potatoes.
Walter Senko survived his 9 months in the Buchenwald concentration camp. Had his imprisonment been longer, he too may have become a statistic. But even then, he would only have been one of a minority Gentile population to die at the hands of the Nazis in the death camps of Europe. The Jews, on the other hand, lost 1/3 of their race, almost the entire Jewish population of Europe. For Senko and thousands like him, Liberation Day could not have come soon enough. On April 11, 1945, at precisely 3:15 p.m., the Buchenwald camp was liberated by American soldiers, a day Walter Senko remembers with gladness and appreciation.
When they came in, one day we didn't hear nothing, shooting, nothing. Second day, we got up in the morning, we could hear heavy artillery, helicopter flying, and we could hear machine guns, they were shooting. Doesn't matter they saw anything or not, they were shooting all the time. Let everybody know they are coming. Yeah, and they just went on, you know, to different city, different German parts. And we were loose. Open up the door, go wherever you want. You want to go somewhere to somebody, go.
The Allied soldiers who liberated the Nazi death camps could not believe what they saw. The guards had quickly abandoned their posts, but had left behind ample evidence of their atrocities. There were bodies everywhere, in the extermination ditches and in the crematoria. Those who were not in fact dead appeared as dead men walking, barely more than skeletons that were still breathing. And then there was the stench, the awful smell that lingered over the camps, caused by the constant burning of human flesh. This was Hitler's final solution, the attempt to exterminate an entire race of people. The liberating soldiers who had witnessed war up close and personal had not seen anything quite like the scenes that greeted them from within the concentration camp perimeters. How could people be capable of such acts of cruelty and mass extermination? And how could they possibly convince the world at large that such things had occurred in the first place? Especially those living on distant continents, far from the battlegrounds of Europe. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was among the first to realize the horrors of the Holocaust should be captured on film. He understood that in time there would be those who would deny it ever took place. A pictorial record would prevent these detractors from rewriting history. It would also serve as a reminder to future generations that no society, however civil it claimed to be, was totally immune to the influences of unspeakable evil. Somehow, the realities of the Holocaust had to be preserved and illustrated by photographs for the benefit of generations yet unborn. The world needed to know and to ask the hard questions of why and how the Holocaust occurred. What did the Jewish people do to warrant such widespread persecution? These questions demanded answers because, by the end of the Second World War, approximately 6 million Jewish men, women, and children had been exterminated as a consequence of Hitler's plan to destroy the Jewish race. This tremendous cost in human lives was something the world should never forget. But it was at the same time a Jewish tragedy of such immense proportions that Jewish people themselves dare not forget, much less allow the world to forget. Abraham's children had walked through the darkest of valleys and survived, but then only barely.
The other thing I noticed at Yad Vashem was they had one cattle car representing thousands of cattle cars that were used by the Nazis to transport the Jewish people to the death camps. And those cattle cars were crammed with people. I mean, it was, in a sense, standing room only. Sometimes for days at a time, other times for hours. But imagine the cramped situation with very little ventilation and lack of sanitary means. I mean, think of the cruelty of all of that. And then if they survived that and got to the death camp, then what waited for them there? You know, there is at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem a place they call the Valley of Lost Communities. It's at the lower level of the museum itself. And you can walk through what seem to be concrete canyons, but on the pillars that are there are the names of the communities of Europe that were systematically, ethnically cleansed of Jews during the Holocaust. And there are something like 5,000 names of communities. So that means 5,000 lost communities in the Valley of Lost Communities at Yad Vashem. That's 5,000 villages and towns systematically cleansed of Jewish people just because they were Jewish people.
It is perhaps appropriate that it was a Jewish author who once asked, "Why do bad things happen to good people?" He asked this question against the backdrop of human suffering that is caused by sickness and disease, and by natural disasters such as famines, tornadoes, tsunamis, and earthquakes. Why, he wondered, did an all-powerful God allow sickness and natural disasters to exact such heavy tolls on human existence? And how did God fit into the realm of suffering? Some have argued that suffering proves that either God does not care for humankind, or that he must not exist. But there were others who still believed in God's goodness, but who saw suffering as the inevitable outcome of free choice that God has bestowed upon humankind. Yet those who believed in God's inherent goodness also believed that in the end, God and his goodness will triumph over evil. Not surprisingly, this is the view the Bible itself seems to support, as it offers an explanation to those who cry out to God in response to their suffering. O Lord God of hosts, how long will you be angry against the prayer of your people? You have fed them with the bread of tears, and given them tears to drink in great measure. You have made us a strife to our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. Restore us, O God of hosts. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. It's important to remember that when God called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he did not promise them or their descendants a painless journey through time. For one thing, he warned them in advance that they would be slaves in Egypt. Nor did God promise them that a life as his light bearers to the nations would be without challenge. He had summoned them to bring in heaven's light into a world caught in the grip of paganism and evil influences. They were to be his champions in a cosmic battle of good versus evil. This would inevitably place at odds with the purveyors of darkness. Remaining faithful to that mandate would prove costly for them, especially so in a world that did not know him. But perhaps this is precisely why they were chosen in the first place. God knew from the beginning that they would cling to him, and that they would somehow rise above the despicable horrors of human existence and the inevitable suffering it brings. They would face the darkest evils imaginable, but they would do so with heaven's light reflected on their faces. And whatever the future held in store, they would always know that God had it within his power to restore them, and whenever necessary, to rekindle their flame of passion. That's why down through the generations they could so readily declare, "Next year in Jerusalem." With God's help, they would always rise above the darkness of cruel circumstances, because they were, after all, his chosen nation.
This past year has been incredibly challenging, from the attacks on Israel to the ongoing struggles faced by the Jewish people worldwide. We've seen heartache, loss, and resilience like never before. Yet in the midst of these trials, C4I has been a source of hope and support in the Holy Land, providing aid, comfort, and a tangible reminder that they are not alone. Your generosity makes this life-changing work possible. Your one-time gift of just $25 or more helps us continue this vital mission. And as a thank you for your support, you will receive the bi-monthly newspaper Israel the Prophetic Connection, filled with stories and articles keeping you informed and up to date on all that is happening in Israel. Call now, 1-888-206-1986, or visit c4iamerica.com to make your one-time donation. Together, we can make a difference for the people of Israel.